very fortunate to start the discussion with one of the leading academics, and if you'll forgive the term, public intellectuals in the academy. Kim Lane Scheppele is the Laurance S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs and Director of the program in Law and Normative Thinking at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. She's a trailblazing scholar, and I really mean that, in examining constitutional systems under stress and on autocratic legalism, focusing at first on Eastern Europe, and now, sadly, on us. She has written tremendous articles and books, including Destroying Democracy by Law, which will be published by the Harvard University Press later this year. Professor Scheppele has won a raft of awards, which I'm not going to list because I want to give her some time to talk, but you can see on her webpage at Princeton. We could not have a better person to start this seminar series and to contextualize what we're seeing around us. I cannot thank Professor Scheppele enough for agreeing to join us. Professor Scheppele, the floor, or rather the Zoom window, is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And it's really nice to be back in the Zoom classroom again. I was one of the few people who didn't mind teaching on Zoom. So glad to see the students here in the Zoom room. And what I'm going to do is to give you, because this is, I guess, your first class, a kind of global overview that will end up focusing on the US by the end. But first, I'm going to sort of introduce you to these problems in the world. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my slides here. And so let me begin. So I'm going to talk about this depressing topic of how to lose a democracy, because the US is obviously not the first place in the world that has run into this issue of having, what had been a relatively stable democracy attacked by a leader that comes to power and then tries to stay in power forever. So I'm going to talk to you about that dynamic, how it's worked in the rest of the world, and then I'm going to bring it home. So let me start by raising this question about whether democracy is really in trouble around the world. There's a huge amount now of political science literature, increasingly legal literature on what has happened to democracy around the world. This is a picture that looks at 100 years of democratic or non-democratic government. And what you see is that over much of the course of the 20th century, the number of countries classifiable as democracies, which are the ones in blue, grew. And it grew spectacularly sort of at the end of the Cold War. And then if you look just at the very right-hand side of that left-hand diagram, what you see is that the number, especially the dark blue, which are kind of what we call consolidated democracies, those have been declining in number, not precipitously. It hasn't fallen off a cliff, but the trends have reversed. And now there are many more governments moving in a more autocratic direction, whereas for, much of the time, maybe say 20 years after the end of the Cold War, more countries were democratizing. So what this group called the Varieties of Democracy group, based in Copenhagen, finally said in its report last year that the level of democracy enjoyed by the average person in 2023 was down to 1985, which is to say still Cold War levels. And by country averages, it's back to 1998, which is to say the world is going in the wrong direction. So the question is, which are the countries that are going in the wrong direction? And this is a chart from the Varieties of Democracy report. This was their 2023 report. You can pick different years. It gives you a kind of 10-year window. And what this chart shows you is along the bottom, they measure something called the Liberal Democracy Index. And that includes things like, are there free and fair elections? Are there checks on power? So some separation of powers kinds of measures, and also civil liberties measures. And it sort of combines those three. It might be a recipe that we could think of as commitments to constitutional democracy. And on the horizontal axis, you see a country score from 2012. On the vertical axis, you see those same country scores from 2022. Now, this chart's easier to read than you think. If a country is above the line, it got better. And if it's below the line, it got worse. And how far away it is from the line tells you how much worse it got. Okay, now these are measures from 2022. Already we're a couple of years later. Brazil has gotten better. Georgia's gotten worse. We can sort of go through. Ecuador's gotten worse. So I wouldn't put them all in exactly the same position, but by and large, the big outliers are still kind of in the position that they're in here. And so those are the named, sort of backsliding countries, I suppose. And so as we talk about this problem of, autocratic consolidation, the countries I'm going to be focusing on and the ones I focus on in my book are the ones that are kind of on the right side of the chart. So ones that did well to begin with, but that are below the line, because those are the ones that you would have expected because they were pretty solid democracies going into their transformations, that they'd be able to stay that way. And the answer is that they haven't. So the question is then, how do these democracies fail? So we know sort of that they do. So the question is how? And the good news is that they fail in better ways. And by better ways, I mean, not so many coups anymore. There used to be lots of coups overthrowing democratic governments. And now, even when there are coups, and there's been a little uptick in coup behavior, shall we say, in the last 5 years, even if there are things that look like coups, my colleague Nancy Bermeo says, the autocrats come to power, the military comes to power, somber music on the radio, tanks in the streets. And the first thing they do is tell you when they're going to hold elections, which is to say they promise to do better. So even when there are coups, there's this kind of nod in favor of democratic government being the preferred kind of government. And so democracy is honored in the breach. But a lot of times what we're seeing in most of these countries, we're not seeing actual military coups. What we're seeing instead is a government that comes to power and destroys democracy using legal means. And they do this by often adopting like the worst practices of good states so that they look like they're compliant with democratic norms when in fact they're not. And so this is where I've been saying liberal democracy is undermined by legalism. This is what I've been calling sort of autocratic legalism. So let me just give you a little evidence on coups. So this is a chart that shows you from 1950 to 2016. Actually, we've had a few more coups since 2016, but the gray bars show you like how many different coups were attempted in any particular year, and the red ones are the successful ones. What you should also note, because the chart doesn't fully convey that, is that the sheer number of countries has gone up a lot since then. So when you look at the sheer number of coups, if you divide it by the available governments that could have one, the number of coups has really gone down, right? Because there's just lots more states. And what you see there is that area that's kind of shaded in gray. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, kind of looking at the area shaded in gray, but that's the Cold War. And during the Cold War, there were lots of coups that happened because the Soviet Union would sponsor a coup by a government that looked like it was tilting in the U.S. direction, and U.S. would do the same. Once the Cold War was over, coups kind of went out of fashion. So then that sets up what's happening now, which is democracies dying by law. And the way that democracies die by law is that gradually the checks on the executive branch in particular are dismantled. What you really have to look out for if you're looking at democratic to autocratic transitions is what's happening to the executive and what's the legal sea in which that executive is swimming. And so there was another study done by this Varieties of Democracy project, this Keeping the Democratic Facade study. And what they showed was that since 1990, so since the end of the Cold War, end of high coup period, 70% of all major extensions of executive power were permitted by law. And half of those were accomplished by reinterpreting existing law rather than creating new law, right? Which is to say, executives are expanding their power, but they're doing it legally. Okay, so here's the small bit of good news in all of that, which is when autocrats are doing that, they typically don't usually engage in traditional human rights violations on a mass scale. They don't massively arrest the entire political opposition. They don't shut down newspapers by force. They're not engaged in sort of massive, how to put it, just, sort of violation. They don't ban all protests, just some, and so on. So they don't usually go after civil liberties in a mass way. But instead, they focus on this other dimension of constitutionalism, right, which is not the right side so much as the separation of power side. And they're consolidating power so that it no longer rotates. Also, one of the things you see is that they don't go after traditional civil liberties of the political and civil sort. They may go after social rights. So oftentimes they weaponize welfare provision, especially in countries that don't guarantee that people have a minimum standard of living or housing or education. They'll go after those things precisely because they're not legally entrenched. And so I won't go on what's on the right side of the slide here about the limitations of the 20th century vision of human rights, but it turns out that in most countries, there is no individual right to a democratic government or an individual right to checked and balanced powers, or even an individual right to the rule of law. So those are the spaces in which the autocrats are playing precisely because the international norms are not as settled, right? So they're taking advantage of gaps in our understanding of rights. So if we're going to focus on legalistic autocracy, what you have to recognize is that democracy dies not with tanks in the streets or phalanxes of soldiers, but it's done with lawyers. One reason why I want to talk to law students, right, is that you guys are in the front lines of this stuff, and the legal profession is in the front lines of this stuff. And it's really important that lawyers understand in particular where the dangers lie. All right, so I'm going to give you some examples of how this autocratic legalism works up close, and in particular how it spreads, from one country to another, because the autocrats are all learning from each other. So let me give you a couple of examples here. So first, if an autocrat is going to do things that used to count as unconstitutional under the legal system they inherited, one of the ways to stave off the accusations of unconstitutionality is to simply disable the highest court that could tell them that what they're doing is unconstitutional. So you go back to Turkey in 2010. This is, Mr. Erdogan, who's been in power now for 25 years, I guess, started off as a good guy, actually, and then he gradually started moving in an autocratic direction. And one of the first things he did was to try to capture the Constitutional Court, their highest court that rules on constitutional questions. So what he did was incredibly clever. First, they changed the law to give that court lots and lots of new cases. There are cases involving individual human rights as opposed to structural problems. It massively increased the number of cases that went to that court. And then Erdogan turned around and he said, oh, look, the court is overworked. And because it's overworked, they need lots of new judges. So we're going to expand the number of judgeships, and I'm going to appoint all these great new judges. And the next thing you know, all those judges were ruling in favor of autocratic consolidation of power, even though they were still kind of upholding human rights, right? So the point was he was packing the court to engage in autocratic consolidation. And weirdly, because he had expanded the ability of the court to handle these human rights cases, the Council of Europe, the European Union, a lot of his allies, including the US, all thought this was great, right? So this is how you pack a court in plain sight and get the cheering adulation of, consolidated democracies. So then Hungary copied the exact same thing the year later when Viktor Orban came to power. Expand the jurisdiction of the court, say it's going to get tons more cases, more judges, pack the court, and then it's all over. Okay, so that's what I'm thinking of as happening in a lot of these places, right? You have to look behind the formal rationales to see what's the actual effect of some of these changes. So here's another trick. This one started in Hungary. How do you capture the ordinary courts? Because it would be very helpful if the ordinary courts just did the executive's bidding and stood down and stopped trying to challenge him. So in many countries in the world, going into a judicial career is in fact a career. There's often a track in law school, or there's special state exams that you qualify to become a baby judge, and then you're appointed like a civil servant sort of up through the system of promotions. What that means is that the oldest judges are typically in the highest positions, right? When you have that kind of civil service judiciary. And frankly, most judiciaries outside the common law world function like that. So Hungary had that kind of judiciary. So suddenly, overnight, Viktor Orban comes to power, trying to capture the courts. He just lowers the judicial retirement age from 70 to 62. Okay, now, this was also not that controversial because many countries were raising the judicial retirement age. So there was nothing kind of sacred about retirement ages, except the effect of lowering the retirement age was to lop off the senior-most 15% of the judiciary, suddenly giving the government the ability to put people into all those jobs that they wanted. Decapitation and recapitation, so to speak. They just remade the judiciary. This was so effective at trying to neutralize the effect of the ordinary courts. And by ordinary courts, I mean the ones that don't handle constitutional questions, right? So just the garden variety judiciary. It was so successful that Hungary exported it to Egypt the following year. Now, the government in place in Egypt that year was the Muslim Brotherhood, sort of a more extreme Islamist government. Viktor Orban, known as Mr. Islamophobe during the whole wave of, immigration that came a few years later, had no qualms in either borrowing a judicial reform from a Muslim country or exporting one to an even more radical Muslim country, right? So this is not, these things don't travel in the usual ideological patterns. It's a reason for kind of pointing that out. So Egypt adopted this in 2012, and then Poland adopted it in 2018 when their autocratic government came into power. So again, you see these ideas kind of moving around. Let me give you one more example. This one starts in the US. So the United States has this law that it passed in 1938 called the Foreign Agents Registration Act. It requires all NGOs and lobbyists sort of operating in the public space to declare themselves and disclose their sources of foreign funding. In the US, lobbyists and foreign funded NGOs are a tiny part of the mix of all lobbyists and all NGOs. So this hasn't really had a huge effect on damaging civil society, or for that matter, really stopping lobbying. But in 2010, Russia passed a law that was a copycat law requiring all NGOs and foreign lobbyists to register in Russia and disclose their funding. But of course, in Russia, almost all the human rights NGOs had foreign funding. So suddenly they are required to register. They're limited in what they can do in politics, and they're all labeled foreign agents. And the people who are associated with them then come to be stigmatized and so on. So here's an American law repurposed in Russia. Okay, so it was pretty successful at killing off a lot of the human rights community in Russia. So then in 2016, Israel passed a similar law when it was running into a lot of problems with the international human rights community. And then in 2017, Hungary adopts this law. 2020, India adopts this law, and so on. So what you're seeing now is just the spread of this law that was passed for one purpose in the US being, sort of weaponized throughout all of these autocratic leaning governments, so that in the end, what they wind up doing is having this pressure on the civil sector. And then when they're criticized by the US, for example, they say, well, you started it, so it sort of launders what they're doing under the guise of something acceptable. Electoral laws. So the US invents gerrymandering. That's the original, should be called gerrymandering, right? Because Elbridge Gerry, the guy who invents this, doesn't pronounce his name with a soft G. That was the original gerrymander, and the US does it. Everybody knows it. And now the US and its election consultants have exported this to the rest of the world. So in Hungary, the way that Viktor Orban has rigged all the elections since he came to power was that they first got a constitutional amendment to cut the size of the parliament in half that allowed them to gerrymander, to redraw all the districts at once in the country. And in 2018, I put here that, his party won 45% of the vote and 98% of the districts, right? So that's an American export that, again, has gotten a lot of traction in these autocratic countries. So what you're seeing is that there's this kind of spread of worst practices, where these legalistic autocrats learn from each other. They borrow tactics that work in one country that, America still was considered a model democracy, even though it does that. So borrowing it, how bad can you be, right? And so these tools are adapted from good democracies. They circulate around among autocrats, even autocrats who believe in like diametrically opposed things, right? And so there's a kind of playbook, as I'll describe in the next part of my talk, that they all follow in adapting these techniques. Now, I've called this the Frankenstate. If you've ever read Mary Shelley's novel, you'll know that Dr. Frankenstein is the monster, is the doctor. The monster he creates by going to cemeteries and digging up bodies and attaching the torso of one to the head of another, to the arms and legs of, seventh and eighth people, and so on. And the monster is created by sort of creating these combinations of, what used to be normal body parts. And a lot of these autocratic systems are constructed by mixing and matching laws from different countries, taken out of context, repurposed when they're attached to something else, right? And then it creates the monster. But if you look at each individual piece, it looks like a normal body part, right? And so that's how they're kind of getting away with it. So I've called this kind of, bricolage of stuff a Frankenstein. So now let me turn to the playbook. Okay, so these are some of the guys that I study in my book. So, Putin in Russia and Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Chavez in Venezuela. On the left, you see Viktor Orban on the left and Yaroslav Kaczynski on the right. These are all guys who came to power in their, democratic systems. They were all pretty decent democratic systems when they came to power, and then they crashed them, right? So the question is really, how do they do that? And I've divided it into 10 handy steps. So what I'm going to do is go through sort of the autocratic playbook in the world, and then think about the US as I do this, because I'm going to come back after I do the rest of the world to what's happened in the US on the 10 steps of the autocratic playbook, okay? So it may be a little ironic that the first step in autocratic capture is that an aspirational autocrat, somebody who is playing by democratic rules to be able to contest power in an election, but they have the goal of staying in power forever once they get there, right? So they have to win an election. And all of the people I just showed you on the previous slide won their first elections fair and square. In fact, I've gone back to look at what election monitors said about these elections that bring aspirational autocrats to power, and they all pass muster with international observers, right? So they come to power in free and fair elections. They often do it on these kind of populist platforms, can be left populist, right populist. The ideological content of all this stuff doesn't really matter as much as the techniques they use. And many elections that are certified as free and fair do not lead to autocracy. So obviously having a free and fair election doesn't look like the worst first step, okay? Except that many of these aspirational autocrats gave warning signals before they were elected. So Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil had both shown that they were willing to use violence to achieve political ends. I mean, Chavez actually attempted a military coup. Bolsonaro was talking to rogue parts of the military about potentially undermining Brazilian government. So, everybody knew that before they were elected. Viktor Orban had been in power once before, and, he had been a reasonably conservative but safe prime minister. But when he was voted out of office in 2002, and when he was not reelected again in 2006, he denied the election results. And after 2006, we now know, though we didn't know completely at the time, that there was all this post-election violence, which was completely odd for Hungary. And it was fomented by Orban's people, which is to say, he had already shown he wasn't going to accept losing an election. And then when he's elected in 2010, off to the races, right? So Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, his party had been banned several times. He'd spent time in jail for violating election rules. And then when he runs for office, for national office, and he's elected in 2003, again, he had already shown beforehand that he was somebody who might be potentially dangerous. So it's not the case that you can have free and fair elections, but the candidates who are aspirational autocrats often show their true colors before they're elected to high office. So it's worth watching out for that. Okay, first step. Second step, aspirational autocrats come to power and they need to neutralize the parliament, because the whole point is they want to govern by themselves, right? And what's really interesting about so many of these cases is that Congress, the parliament, the legislature, either is full of party loyalists who just say, executive, over to you. We're not going to challenge you. We're on the same camp. They either just give in to what the executive wants, or they simply pass enabling acts, grants of emergency power, just say, we're just going to delegate lots and lots of powers to you, And this just happens over and over again. You can go back to Nazi Germany, where it happened with Hitler in Orban's Hungary. I mentioned that the first act, he got the parliament to vote to cut the size of the parliament in half. Then he goes to his political party and he says, half of you won't be here after the next election. And if you want support from me on my party ticket, you will vote for everything I put in front of you, right? So this can happen in various kinds of ways. And so legislatures just give up, occasionally, but actually relatively occasionally, relatively rarely, you find that the executive will simply dissolve the parliament, or prorogue it, meaning suspending it for a while. But usually parliaments just give up in the face of a strong executive. It's just astonishing, but it's just the thing that happens. Step 3, okay. Again, capturing the judiciary. Now, I've already shown you a couple of the tactics through which, aspirational autocrats have captured their judiciaries, but a lot of what they need to do is either to pack the courts, which they do by often changing the rules for electing judges, or sometimes what happened in Poland, for example, was the government created a new disciplinary chamber of the Supreme Court. And then the government loyal judges would refer judges that disagreed with the government to the disciplinary chamber, which would then discipline them for disagreeing with the government, right? So you set up a kind of incentive system, which means that most judges will go along to get along. Sometimes you can just create completely new judicial qualifications. So one of the ways that Orban also tried to capture the Supreme Court in Hungary was by renaming it and then saying that all the judges on the court had to go back through a new credentialing process to get back onto the court. And the new credentialing process, everyone passed through it except one judge, the president of the court. And then suddenly he was out. And they did that whole exercise just to get rid of the president of the court under guise of what looked like a perfectly legal transformation, right? So there's all kinds of ways that the judiciary can be captured. Next, capturing the bureaucracy. Because if you have an independent civil service, especially full of people who are like experts in their particular, line of work, shall we say, you get a new government that comes in and tells them to do the opposite of what they've done, and they resist because they know it's not done that way. There are often cultures of these bureaucracies that will resist executive action that tells them to do stuff they didn't think they should be doing. So how do you get rid of them? Well, again, suspending the civil service, mass firing bureaucrats is a very common thing that you see at the outset of a lot of these autocratic governments. Again, when Viktor Orban, I spent a lot of time living and working in Hungary, so that's always my go-to case. But when Viktor Orban was elected in 2010, Hungary had gone bankrupt under the prior government. It's one of the reasons why he was elected. And the International Monetary Fund had come in with these very strict conditions telling the new government, namely Orban, you have to cut the federal budget. You have to cut the national budget by a lot. So Orban suspended the civil service law, mass fired employees, and then paid off the IMF with money he stole from public pensions. That's a different story. But once the IMF was off his back, he then hires his own buddies into all these jobs and then reinstates the civil service law. Okay. But again, when he mass fired civil servants, it turned out he mass fired all the ones that weren't part of his party. And the IMF and international organizations cheered him on because he was lowering the state budget. So, sometimes they do this stuff and they not only don't get criticized, but they get cheered on. So again, it's turning the professional bureaucracy into a bureaucracy that has partisan loyalty rather than expertise as its main tool is, again, something, because again, if you think about autocracy is about consolidation of power in the executive so it doesn't rotate. So they have to neutralize all the things that would stop them. And so civil service is one of them. So then there may be other checks on executive power besides just getting rid of the parliament, the judiciary, and the civil service. And this is the next thing you see autocrats start to do. So you start to see an increasing prominence of governing by decree. So rather than going back through the parliament, which may have, given a lot of powers to the executive, maybe, sleeping because they don't want to get involved in this autocratic capture, governing by decree becomes really common. Blowing past norms that aren't laws, again, very common. We have ethics requirements. Really, it's not required. Who's going to punish me if I don't? I won't report, right? So you start seeing executives just circumventing all the external checks, appointing temporary employees into their office to bypass whatever the requirements of the office are, and so on. And then, of course, the farther along this goes, the more you see executives refusing to recognize or follow court decisions, or refusing to acknowledge and entrenching on the powers of the legislature. So again, it's this executive that keeps getting more and more powerful, blowing over all the constraints. 6, filling key positions with loyalists. So it's not just about getting rid of whoever was there before and clearing stuff out of the way. Autocrats also want to do things. So they want to appoint into key government positions people who will do things. And in particular, they want the folks who might oppose them, autocrats want the people who might oppose them, to be gotten out of the way. Okay. And so this is where it becomes absolutely crucial to capture the public prosecutor's office, to enable the weaponization of public prosecution. It's important to capture the police, the military, the intelligence services, all the kind of what I call like repressive offices, right? The ones that can either harass your opponents, jail them, put them under suspicion and investigation, creating new loyalist police units. Again, Viktor Orban did that by creating this anti-terrorism police. Looked fine on paper, turned out to be a police unit with unlimited surveillance powers. So he's been able to spy on everybody ever since. Tax enforcement is another thing. You can really harass businesses by suddenly subjecting them to tax audits of different kinds, right? So those offices in particular are the ones that enable these aspirational autocrats to put everyone in fear of challenging them. Because if you start to challenge them, then they bring down this whole repressive, arm of the state onto you, and then, you're miserable. So that's another key thing. Part 7. I only have 10 parts. I'm almost done. Then I'm going to turn to the US. Okay. Creating a media echo chamber. Okay. Now, this is actually really interesting because what you see in these new autocracies is not what you saw in old 20th century dictatorships. They don't just storm in with the police and shut down the newspapers, or the websites or whatever. Instead, in order to ensure that the public hears only what the government wants them to hear, they either engage in sort of regulation of the media for good purposes, like, for example, we're going to stop child pornography, so we have to review every single website and every single authorization or whatever. But what they typically do is they go after the economic basis of free media. So free media in two senses, right? One is that it doesn't charge the public the full cost of news gathering, but also that it is independent of government constraints. So what you saw, and again, I can go to, actually this happened first in Russia, where Vladimir Putin first went after the business interests of the oligarchs who controlled the independent and opposition media, threatening to remove and to seize basically all of their property if they didn't soften their line in what their media operations were doing. Getting rid of advertisers, threatening the advertisers. If this happened in Hungary, any advertiser in a medium that the government didn't approve of would be told, if you continue to advertise with this newspaper, with that radio station, then you will never get another government contract. What happened also in Hungary was that they simply cut all the public funds that went to advertising in the media that they wanted to bring down. And then they started deluging the media with libel actions and other harassment lawsuits to litigate their expenses way up, right? And so after doing this for a few years, what you see now in Hungary is that less than a quarter of the media outlets in Hungary are free of government influence. And when it says here public service media, don't think PBS, think government mouthpiece media, because they took control of that too, right? But they did it mostly through financial means to create this media echo chamber. 8, threatening civil society and the political opposition. Okay. And this is where, again, Orban kind of pioneered this, and now lots of other governments have borrowed this from him. If you look at any national budget, you'll discover that a lot of it consists of tax breaks, tax-exempt status, state subsidies, and public grants to everything from arts agencies to social service providers to NGOs. In most countries, political parties are also subsidized by the state. So what Orban pioneered was weaponization of the national budget, where overnight, preferably suddenly, you just cut all the money to everybody who might oppose you. And then they run around trying to figure out how are we going to survive. And also there's a shrinking pie of money that's available from non-government sources. So they start competing with each other, for business support, for foundation support. And then that pits them against each other. And it means that you ununify, you disunify, you create chaos out of the political opposition, right? Because they're all trying to survive. Sometimes, in some states, they even criminalize the actions of the civil sector. So again, one of the genius things that Viktor Orban did was when he decided to run an anti-migration campaign. They started arresting the lawyers who were representing migrants and their asylum claims. And then the minute the asylum claim was turned down, they changed the law so everybody was turned down. The minute the asylum claim was turned down, the lawyer would be arrested for human trafficking, helping somebody cross borders illegally. Okay, so that's how they arrested all the immigration lawyers. So they can just weaponize what, powers of state against all their potential opponents. And this works, doubly for political parties up to and investigating, jailing political rivals. Okay, this is always the surprising one to many people. So again, in autocratic consolidation, you don't usually see tanks in the streets. That's why what's happening in Washington, D.C. is kind of off my script a bit, and I'll talk about that later. But what typically happens, because again, these governments want to appear to be democracies while they're doing all this. They're trying to, borrow laws from good democracies. They're not engaged in mass repression of the old-fashioned sort. They're trying to still look like a democracy while they're doing all of this. So they can't just, bring out the police and the military and arrest everybody, right? So what do? They pull back the police and allow private violence to do the work for them. So you see rises of private threats. You see rises in, like Viktor Orban worked with football hooligans. And you have this, I put up the human rights report on cow protection in India. So the radical Hindus that support Modi are going around beating up Muslims because they suspect them of eating beef. Okay, and the state just doesn't do anything about it. The police don't enforce the laws, and so that's one thing you often see in these governments. And then the governments say, what are we to do? These cow protection mobs are like not under the control of the government. It's all private violence. And how do we know what they're going to do next? Right. So that's something very common. And the use of public violence actually is relatively less common in these places. Okay. Point 10, the end. So before the autocrat comes up for election again, they don't want to leave office. So what they'll do is they'll rewrite the election rules. And so this is where you see that autocrats don't cancel elections. They want to go on having elections, and they want elections that look to outsiders like they're free and fair elections. So they'll have contested elections. They'll have opposition parties. But between things like gerrymandering, voter suppression, changing the rules at the last minute, this is, again, one of Viktor Orban's favorite tricks, or threatening the loss of government benefits. Like, so you don't vote for our guys, your now discretionary welfare payments get canceled. Or physical violence. These private mobs like show up at the polling places and try to prevent people from voting. And in the end, if all else fails, which it did finally in Venezuela, the guy who loses the election just claims he didn't lose the election, right? And then governs by force. Okay, but the point is that the next election is always a target. And so those are the steps, and by the time you get to step 10, if they succeed in rigging the rules, then this aspirational autocrat doesn't have to leave office. Okay, so now I come to the US. You've been running the US through your head, right? Through that checklist, I hope. Okay, so here we go. So when Project 2025 came out in February of 2024, I read it because I work on declining democracies. I think I was the first on my blog to read all 927 pages or whatever it is. And the first thing I was really struck by is that it sounded like Hungary. And so when journalists would interview me about this, I would say, I don't know who wrote this really. I mean, it was a collection of American conservative groups, but I would not be surprised if Orban had a hand in it. And sure enough, one of the journalists I talked to went out and dug around and discovered that Orban's English language think tank was one of the drafters of Project 2025. So when I keep mentioning all these Hungarian things, it's a tiny country on the edge of Europe that most Americans don't think about. But boy, does it punch above its weight in terms of inventing and then spreading these legalistic autocratic tactics. So as we go along, I'll flag some of the ones that are Hungarian. But I must say, when I read that, I thought, before the election, if they really intend to do this, this will be serious. And here we are. All right. So first, remember, step one, winning a free and fair election with warning signs. Okay, so last November, it wasn't like we didn't have a clue about what Trump would do if he lost an election, because we'd seen it before, right? But even more than that, of course, he had actually said during the election campaign in 2024, I will be a dictator, but only on day one, right? And so, of course, he had already been convicted of felonies in that New York trial. He had been indicted on multiple other felonies in trials that never came to play before the election. But the abundant public evidence that we knew about in at least two of those other cases showed that he had planned to seize power illegally if he'd lost the election in 2020, right? So none of that was mysterious. And that starts to look like these other cases in which Chavez tried to have a coup and, Erdogan had been in jail for election law violations. And so again, we were on notice. All right. What happens to legislatures? Well, like I told you, in all these autocratic cases, the legislature just goes silent, or they just defer, or they just give massive amounts of power to the executive. And sure enough, this is exactly what we've seen. So right at the beginning, remember Trump said the Senate should just go into recess, and that way I can get all my cabinet through without having to go through these annoying hearings, right? And the Congress stood up to him right at the beginning and then stopped, right? So everything since that time, basically, Trump has been dissolving executive branch agencies set up by Congress, and Congress has said nothing. He's been refusing to spend money Congress has allocated, and Congress has said nothing. And the Democrats, at least at the beginning, when there was this budget bill that was about a continuing resolution to make sure the government didn't stop, the Democrats didn't even play all the cards they had to potentially stop it. Now, they did a little more with the big, beautiful bill. There's some limits on how much they could do. But even so, what you're seeing is Congress rolling over and playing dead. I mean, both the majority party in terms of it's not putting a check on its own president, and the minority party not even using all the available tools it might for stalling or, slowing things down, gumming up the works. Capturing the judiciary. Well, Trump in his first term, was able to appoint 3 justices to the Supreme Court, a really unusual number of justices if you look at one-term presidents. 2 of those were done irregularly, if you recall. In the first case, the Senate delayed opening hearings on Obama's nominee, thereby putting the nomination over to the next term. And in the second case, they sped up the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett so that Biden wouldn't get the win on that one. So again, it looks like court packing, when you start fiddling with the rules like this. And sure enough, that court, when the cases of election interference came up and Trump claimed he was immune from prosecution because he was president, the Supreme Court gave him this sweeping judgment that was even more than Trump had asked for, right? And so you start to see the Supreme Court at the highest levels. And that decision was surprising because I think almost every constitutional scholar would tell you that there was just no precedent really for that. I mean, all the evidence pointed the other direction if you were going to look and see whether the president was really immune. I mean, why would Gerald Ford pardon Nixon if he wasn't going to be prosecuted anyway? Never mind, lots of evidence. So that was at the beginning. So then Trump comes in and he's issued, hundreds of executive orders. There are now, I think, about 400 cases challenging these executive orders, not counting the individual immigration cases. And the lower courts have almost unanimously tried to stop these executive orders. It's just been remarkable. And that includes judges across the political spectrum. It includes judges Trump himself appointed, because the executive orders in so many cases directly violate acts of Congress. And executive orders are not allowed. I mean, executive orders that override statutes should be dead letters, right? And ditto with executive orders that conflict with standing interpretations of the Constitution. So the lower courts are really holding the line. And then what he started doing was attacking the judges, calling for the impeachment of some of the judges who stood up to him, and really attacking them. And there are now lots and lots of threats against the judiciary, which I'll get to a little bit later. But then some of these cases, I think we've now had, 18 of these cases, which go up to the Supreme Court on the so-called emergency docket or shadow docket. These are cases that usually involve the question of lower courts have issued an injunction saying Trump can't go ahead with what he wants to do. And then the question that goes up to the court, to the Supreme Court is injunction stays or the injunction is lifted. And in virtually every case, in all 18 of the cases, the court has ruled, at least in part, in favor of Trump on things that you would not have guessed they would rule in favor of him on, because in order to lift an injunction, one element of whether an injunction should be issued is the judge's understanding of who they think, which party they think will win. And they tend to issue an injunction if they think the plaintiffs are going to win, to preserve the plaintiff's situation, so that when the case gets decided on the merits, then you can go back and the plaintiff can still have whatever rights were endangered by the actions that are being challenged. The fact that the court has lifted a lot of these injunctions has meant that they think the president's going to win, right? Which means that they think they're going to either overturn their prior case law or interpret statutes in ways that no one has interpreted them before, right? And so in all of these cases, what you're seeing is that the court is signaling to you that they're on board with expanding executive power, even in cases where the executive orders directly violate statutes. And there are two more cases that went up last week. One is on the racial and ethnic profiling that was being done in Los Angeles for these immigration raids. And the other is this one on science grants. And so we expect those to come down pretty soon. But the Supreme Court is not holding the line. The Supreme Court is so far giving in basically on everything. All right, so that's the judiciary. Politicizing the civil service. Well, as you all know, one of the things that the Doge folks did when they came into office was to just go around firing massive numbers of federal workers. It's extremely hard to tell how many have been fired. As of early April, where there was a reasonably good head count, it was about 125,000. If there are 2.4 million federal workers, it's not a lot, but the question is where they were located. And essentially what you saw was this repurposed federal agency, now called Doge, going into agencies and engaged in mass firings of people, sort of dismantling whole parts of agencies and whole agencies. And so it was just a massive effort to get rid of civil servants. There was this fork in the road memo that went out right after Trump took office, saying to all civil servants, resign now and we'll pay you through September. Actually, the way that they compiled the database for the email that was sent out, they just put all federal employees in the same email. And so all federal judges got this too, except the Supreme Court, which has its own domain. So they also got a lot of voluntary retirements. And the court has been upholding these mass firings by and large, the Supreme Court, not the lower courts. So again, it's like completely politicizing, changing, putting in terror the civil service, dismantling checks on power. There's so many ways this is happening. They're hard to count. But the crucial thing is basically that Trump is operating by executive order, right? Regardless. I mean, this is like the classic thing, like don't even bother to go to the legislature, work by executive order. What Elon Musk was doing in those early months with this agency that was not established by Congress, nobody knew what Musk's employment contract looked like. Was he a federal employee? Who were these guys? Did they have qualifications? What authorized them to go into all these agencies and fire people and start, hand canceling individual grants? The conflicts of interest rules. I mean, Trump has now made, I think the Washington Post had a story last week about a couple of $1 billion that Trump has profited from weaponizing the presidency into, for-profit enterprises and so on. So basically, he's just doing whatever he wants and daring people to stop him, right? Which is the ultimate dismantling of checks on executive power. Installing loyalists in the muscle institutions or the repressive institutions, as they called them. The key thing here has been the Department of Justice. And, there's a picture here of Trump with the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who has been gutting the agency of career lawyers, upending priorities, canceling whole units that would go after some of the people on Trump's side, like completely dismantling the unit that was looking at violent extremism in this country, which tends to be overwhelmingly right-wing, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. The head of the FBI had a hit list, which they're going after. And what you see is this weaponization of investigations, right? They've now reopened the so-called Russia hoax investigations. They've reopened, there's a whole sprawling effort to kind of go after things that Obama did, despite the statute of limitations. So you're just seeing this weaponization of all of these agencies, as well as the IRS, which so far hasn't been doing tax audits, but has been turning over tax data to be matched against immigration records and other kinds of things. And so all of that just meant that it was just gone. I mean, the institutions that, and of course, there's the National Guard, and we'll get to that in a second. All right, turning the media into an echo chamber. So Trump has a long history of suing media outlets for libel, even on cases that he has no chance of winning, just to harass them into submission and make them pay a lot of money. And what you started seeing even before the inauguration was that media outlets that had pending libel actions by Trump started just paying him personally to make these things go away. Because a lot of the media outlets, and again, remember how Orban did it in Hungary, which is you go after the finances of the media, either directly through lawsuits, you just tie them up in litigation and just make them spend the money on lawyers, or you go after the business interests of the oligarchic owners of media. And that was clearly happening with CBS. CBS wanted to, the parent company had a merger before, antitrust authorities. Trump was dangling that until CBS gave in and basically killed off a lot of 60 Minutes. And so you're seeing this weaponization of, and the Washington Post with Jeff Bezos, because of course, Amazon relies at least in part on the post office for delivery in certain parts of the country, and they were threatening to use the post office's leverage against Amazon. So this just means people cave in, right? So this is where we are. All right, attacking civil society and opposition parties. Well, these are the attacks on unions, universities, NGOs, law firms, political rivals. We can go through the list, but it's all the places in independent locations where you would expect large numbers of people to oppose this government. And they've been threatening the law firms with no access to federal buildings. So how are you supposed to go into a courthouse, right? No security clearances. So how can you defend anybody who's got business with the government that requires security clearances, and on and on. Obviously, universities are being hit from all sides. Again, financially, it's the weaponization of the national budget that is one of the biggest things Trump owes to Orban. And that's exactly how they're proceeding. So again, and it's all these kind of attacks on their opponents. Private violence. So we've actually had an immense amount of private violence, starting with the pardoning of all the January 6th convicts or commuting their sentences. But what we've seen is this massive rise in threats. And it's interesting, in Congress, the threats are coming against Republicans to keep them on board with voting for anything Trump puts in front of them. But there's also now threats against the judiciary. There's a judge here in New Jersey where I live, Esther Salas, whose son answered the door one night. This was nothing to do with Trump. It was a disgruntled litigant who turned up on her doorstep, rang her doorbell. And when her son answered the door, the guy on the doorstep shot her son dead on the doorstep. What we've seen since Trump has come back to power the second time, at least as of several weeks ago, it was up to 60 federal judges and their kids have gotten free pizza delivery. Your doorbell rings, you go, there's a guy with a pizza box saying, "Hi, free pizza for you." And then you go and look to see who it's from. And these pizza deliveries to the federal judges, which first of all say, "We know where you live," right? The pizza deliveries are coming in the name of Daniel Salas, the murdered son of the federal judge. Everybody knows what that means. Judges are terrified. And it's the judges ruling against Trump that are getting the pizza deliveries. Okay, so this is what I mean by private violence. Who's doing it? Is the Justice Department investigating it? No. So it's pulling back the police and letting private violence fill this gap and create this atmosphere of threats. Okay, I couldn't resist this because now we're also seeing public violence, which is pretty unusual in the context of these autocratic takeovers that I'm seeing. But this, you recognize the picture on the upper left. I'm sure you saw the Turkish graduate student from Tufts who was accosted on the street by these masked guys without insignia who turn out to be ICE agents. She's lawfully here. They canceled her student visa without her knowing. And then they pick her up and she's detained for weeks. She's now free. But this kind of thing has been happening on the streets. And now, of course, in the last few weeks, the federalization of the National Guard in California, The DC National Guard is already under control of the executive branch, so they didn't have to federalize it to send it out onto the streets. Over the weekend, 3 different states, red state governors, said they would volunteer some of their National Guards to control the massive crime problem in DC. So we're seeing tanks in the streets. Literally, if you saw Union Station, Washington, DC this weekend, it was surrounded by military vehicles. That's unusual. Okay, 10, rewriting the election laws. Okay, so Trump signed an executive order back in March, and that executive order is being put into effect by U.S. attorneys around the country, particularly here in New Jersey, where Alina Habba, who just went through a Magic Act to stay went from interim to an acting U.S. attorney, has created an election integrity task force here in New Jersey because we have a gubernatorial election this year. And she has already said she is devoted to wiping out mail ballots, which a big proportion of the state votes by mail. So you're starting to see the run up to the midterms. Trump is already, if you've seen, Trump has all the 2028 hats. He actually gave one to the visiting dictator from Azerbaijan a couple of weeks ago. It's like, hi, I'm one of you. He doesn't usually borrow legal tricks from Azerbaijan, but never mind. We had a case in the 10th Circuit where a case hinged on the question of whether Trump would still be in office after 2028. And this judge says, well, we should be reluctant to opine on a novel and complex constitutional question, as in it wasn't obvious that he couldn't run a 3rd term. And then today, I don't know if you saw this. This is the Truth Social post from this morning. I am going to lead a movement to get rid of mail-in ballots, and also to get rid of voting machines. Okay, this is a long rant, but basically, elections can never be honest with mail-in ballots. I and everybody, in particular the Democrats, knows this. I and the Republican Party will fight like hell to bring honesty and integrity back to our elections. Mail-in ballot hoax, using voting machines that are a complete and total disaster. They're going to try. First of all, the federal government has no jurisdiction here on how people vote. That has always been a state law issue. Who knows with the Supreme Court? But what they're going to try to do is just create chaos before the midterms. Okay, so coming soon to a state near you. You're already in a state, which is probably going to be on the cutting edge of all this. But literally, what they're trying to do is to throw. I mean, this is only a year before ballots have to be printed, basically, for next year's election, and to cast this level of chaos into the process that late in an election cycle is inviting an election that will not be free and fair next year for the midterms. Okay, so what is to be done? I'm just going to end with a couple of what can you do points here. If I haven't scared you, you haven't been paying attention. You look like you're all paying attention. So what is to be done? Okay, so I've worked on this stuff in other countries, and so I've been through this in other places. And so I think there are still things that can be done, but it's important to do them, and it's important to do them fast, because the more a government like this gets entrenched, the harder it is to dislodge it. This is the vulnerable period before everything is absolutely locked down. So this is when it's crucial to act. So if a democracy can be dismantled by law, it can be rebuilt or saved from destruction by law also. This is why, again, I love talking to law students, right? So what autocrats do is they attack national constitutional law. That's their target, right? Because if the point is to remove checks on executive power and stay in power forever, it's the national constitution that would stop them from doing that. But there are other levels of law. Okay, so when I worked on this in Hungary and in Poland, there was the EU above them. They had signed on to a whole dense network of Council of Europe, European Union law that basically required you to be a democracy to be in good standing in those organizations. So what I and my colleagues could do was to go up to the EU. It took us 12 years of, creating the legal arguments for why they should move in that direction, writing the law review articles that supported it, getting the cases to the high court, getting the court to agree. I must say that one of my proudest achievements in the last decade is being cited 4 times by the European Court of Justice for things that nobody thought they would ever do. Okay. And so, but that's how we built it. We built it gradually at this upper level to warn them and to tell them that if the EU didn't crack down on democratic backsliding, they would lose their EU, right? Now, the US doesn't sign on to any international organization it can't control. So we don't have that option of going up. But what we have in the US, which they didn't have in Hungary and Poland, is federalism. And so what I'm thinking is that there's this whole other level of law that can be weaponized against what's happening at national level. At least I live in a blue state. You guys are in Florida. It's a harder sell, but even so, who knows? There might be options even in Florida. Some of you were smiling. But, here in New Jersey, we have a really fierce state attorney general. What's happened since Trump came to office in January 20th, is that the blue state attorneys general, they started meeting a year before the election. As soon as they saw Project 2025, they started meeting to figure out issue spot. Where are we going? If he gets elected and this is the plan, what do we do? They meet daily now. They've filed 30 to 40 major lawsuits challenging big chunks of what Trump is up to. And so far they're winning. Now, their cases haven't really gone up to the Supreme Court yet. See what they do. But what the state level AGs can then do is back into state constitutional law. So, for example, state constitutional law in many states has stronger protections of voting rights than the national government does. So lean into this, and I'm just thinking that this may be also where we build a resistance to that if the national institutions are all not working, right? So maybe we can try to rebuild this at state and local level. If you're in a state that's not great, maybe your local government is better, maybe your county government is better, but just so think about these other levels. And so that was what I did at the EU level. And so here's the blue states, here's the blue state AGs. The blue state AGs have brought, all these different cases now. They're the ones to watch because I think they're the most effective organized resistance that has governmental resources to work with. And so how to think about this, and this is kind of what I want to leave you with, is that I teach a course called The Rule of Law. And usually when you think about the rule of law, what the whole legal literature talks about is rule of law as if you've got one level, national constitutional law. Is it contradictory? Does it give people fair notice? Is it, stable? All those kinds of security and predictability requirements. But if you think of the rule of law not as just what I call writ small at one level, but you go back to this diagram, like not just that one level that autocrats are attacking, but you think across the levels, you get a picture of what I'm calling now the rule of law writ. Whoops, I'm going back. I didn't mean to go back. We've got lots of slides here. The rule of law writ large. Okay. And what that means is think about how you harmonize across these levels. How have state constitutions guaranteed a lot of rights that are going to start failing us at national level? How is state law going to guarantee checks on executive power at national level because the states are supposed to be independently powerful, right? That's the rule of law writ large. When you get contradictions across the levels, it's always a problem. There's no reason why all the state law has to comply. I mean, yes, there's a supremacy clause. We can figure out how to fight back. Even conservative courts have always said that, states' rights and all that. So let's try to lean into that. So that's where I think we can direct a lot of our legal energies. If we don't succeed in getting the federal courts to eventually stop this, then we retreat to the states. And so therefore, this might be the end of my lecture, but it's not the end of all that. So thanks much.